Okay. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Just a few things to mention. I want to welcome everybody. Again, we have a large group, so thank you so much for being here. My name is Dina Evans, and I'm so happy to be with you. I'm the Marketing Special Events Manager here at LookingGlass. Very quickly, I'm just going to give you a little bit about LookingGlass. We have a very broad portfolio of products and services that deliver unified threat protection against sophisticated cyber attacks to global enterprises as well as government agencies all over the world. We do that by operationalizing our threat intelligence across our end-to-end portfolio. I'm not going to make this a big commercial, but we've got 20-plus years of experience helping our customers to defend their network, brand, customers, and employees. And we're very, very proud of it. But as a part of that, so let's dive in a little bit today. Our presentation topic is Don't Believe the Hype. The dark web is just another source for intelligence. And so with that, I'm excited to introduce our presenters. Here from LookingGlass, we have Eric Olson, who is the VP of Intelligence Operations. And we have James Carnell, who's the VP of our Cybersecurity Center. And before I pass it to these fine gentlemen, I just want to bring up a couple other housekeeping notes. So let me proceed. Yes, we do have that Q&A feature that you can present your questions to our presenters today. We are eager to fill those questions, but please note that we will address those at the end of the presentation. But you can submit those throughout, but they will address those at the very end. If we happen to run out of time, feel free to keep bringing them in, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. We'll send you an email directly. And that Q&A feature does just give questions directly to us, the presenters. It's not viewed by the rest of the audience. So if there's anything private that you would like addressed or just a one-on-one, please note that when you submit your questions, and we'll be sure to send you an answer directly, rather than addressing it over the audio portion. There's also a resources list that has some great stuff that is relevant to our webcast today on the dark web, so feel free to peruse through those. And then at the bottom right, there's an envelope icon that you can contact us directly. But with that, hopefully you're familiar and you've got a good view of your screen now. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to our presenters. We have Eric and we have James, and we will let them go ahead and get started. Gentlemen?
Thank you very much, Dina, and good afternoon to everybody that's joined us today. So again, as we typically do, Eric and I, we'd like to start by giving some guideposts of what it is that we'll be talking about today. So we'll be defining and going over some buzzwords. We want to know, essentially let you know that the dark web's out there and not to believe all the hype. So we're going to go through some hypes and myths there. What it actually is. Hopefully we'll cover that for you in such a way that you'll understand it a little better when we're done. What it looks like, how big it is, spoiler alert, not as big as you think, and what's down there and why should I care anyway, and then how we go into intelligence gathering and what the value is of monitoring that space in other ways. So Eric, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
It's my pleasure, Dina. James, thank you very much, and everyone out there listening, thanks for joining us today. Very excited.
So let's get into getting beyond the buzzwords. So Tor and Silk Road and we've got other things like dark web, deep web, and all these other words that we're going to cover today and define a little bit. So let's go in with Tor. Let's start with that.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is common, and for those of you who don't know us, James and I have done a whole series of webinars on meaningless buzzwords in security. Depending on who you ask, the Tor network, which we'll talk about a little more in a few minutes, is often seen as synonymous with the dark web. It is one piece of a much larger picture in our opinion. Silk Road is an infamous dark web marketplace that was shut down a couple of years ago where you could shock by drugs and guns and all kinds of illegal paraphernalia. If you ask my mom, it's anything she can't find in Google. And my personal favorite definition of the dark web is it's a convenient way to move along the plot on a bad TV show when you can't find any other explanation for how some ridiculous twist in the plot has happened. We're going to get past all of this and talk about what the dark web really is.
So as usual, a problem well defined.
is half solved.
So let's get into a little bit more of a definition so we understand what we're talking about today. So let's talk about the surface web. What is that? How do we define that?
Yeah, I think it's important as context to understand that, as James and I have often done with buzzwords, is we see LookingGlass's role in the industry is to put a stake in the ground and say, okay, if you're going to throw around buzzwords, can we at least put some definition around what they actually mean? And so dark web to us is part of a larger picture of defining the available content on the public internet. Surface web is that which is on public websites and easily discoverable, indexed by traditional major search engines, and it is, to use a phrase, a mile wide and an inch deep. There are hundreds of millions of live websites out there with an average of half a dozen pages each. If my mom can find it in a search engine, that's pretty much our definition of the surface web.
And it's a good benchmark. So if you can jump on Google and find it,
that's the surface layer.
Okay, great. So now we want to talk about the social web. So we've talked about the surface web. Now, what is the social web?
So the social web, again, this is just to kind of build a framework around our dark web discussion. The social web is the opposite of the surface web. It is an inch wide and a mile deep. Okay. It is the tiny number of individual websites or domains that contain vast, enormous amounts of continuously user-generated content. Mm-hmm. This is your Facebook, your Twitter, your YouTube, where there may be literally billions of individual pages on a single website.
Very good. Okay. So now this is where we get into that definition. We need to work on the deep web. So how is that different?
So the deep web is characterized by the following attributes, if you will. It is not easily discoverable. These are sites or files, pages, that are not easily discoverable simply by running a search or clicking around. This could be because the sites are not indexed by search engines or block them. Could be because it is dynamically generated content. For example, you must run a query on a database for the page to be generated. It could be large government databases, et cetera, and many people say that this could be as much as 20 times the size of the surface web. Unfortunately, it's also often used in the phrase the deep and dark web, and as we'll discuss in a moment, the two have nothing to do with each other. The deep web, given a URL, given a link to click or an address to visit, can be seen in a standard browser by anyone with that address.
Right, so your mom can't find it on Google, but if we send her an email with the link, she can get there by clicking on it.
Exactly right.
Yeah, gotta love your mom. All right, so let's talk about the dark net.
Yes, and we will just this one time in this discussion make the distinction between the dark net and the dark web, phrases that are typically used interchangeably, and we will talk about the dark web today because that's the phrase people use.
Right.
It is important to distinguish, however, that there is both web type and non-web type content on the, quote, dark net. So we'll get into the distinctions, but the defining characteristic of the dark net as we define it, and I think we do a good job here, and no one else really does except throw around a buzzword, is that whether it is web-style content or non-web-style content, the defining characteristic of dark is it requires specialized software, knowledge, or access, that is, contacts or relationships, to gain access to it.
Very good. So you're not going to stumble into this somehow. You actually need to know where you're going and how to get there.
Yes, you'll either need specialized software like a Tor browser for Tor content. You may need specialized knowledge. For example, many closed forums or dark forums require you to pass a coding test and chat with the administrator in Ukrainian before they'll let you into the clubhouse.
Understood. All right, so let's talk about, in preparation for this webinar today, some of the hype and some of the myths there, and we've got some of them listed here. So, it's a huge underground network that you need to be a sophisticated expert to be able to use it, right? And only criminals use it. And then there's really bad stuff down there.
And why is that?
Well, because it's impenetrable to law enforcement or to government, and they can't find their way around there. And you can buy anything you want. Anything's down there. It's all for sale. And the hackers, if you go in there, they know who you are. And that's important because if you don't know what you're doing, the bad guys will find you?
So the asterisk on the screen is basically to say that of the things shown here, that last one is the closest to true.
So they know who you are. Okay. So we're going to come back to that, right?
Most of these have some grain of truth to them,
okay,
but have been blown wildly out of proportion, and that's where we talk about the hype. We will, in the next 20 or 30 minutes, we will dispel everything from it's huge, it's not, to it's impenetrable and law enforcement can't see anything down there,
right,
totally wrong,
right,
to if you go down there, the hackers will instantly know who you are.
Right.
Not true. So we'll get into the truth of the matter as we go.
So we're going to debunk some of these, but let's talk about our stance. Where's LookingGlass in regards to these things?
Yeah. Our stance is, yes, the dark web is a valuable source, and we will talk about the reasons from a business perspective. It is actually a useful potential source for intelligence. It is one of many, but it is just another set of content sources, no different than social media platforms and search engines and websites and lots of other things that a good open source or online monitoring program or brand protection program would encompass. Very quickly, that dark definition, as we put it, includes both web-style content on various networks, including Tor, I2P, ZeroNet, and Freenet, IRC, which is an older protocol of instant messaging style text communication.
Internet relay chat, right?
Yep. Internet relay chat. Think of it as primitive instant messenger.
Right.
Closed forums, as we said, these could be on the surface web or the dark web or run on some alternate protocol. The key characteristic or common trait is you have to go through some hoops and jump some hurdles in order to be allowed access. There are places to exchange and swap and upload large files,
right,
and there are places to buy and sell stuff. In other words, it's a lot like the regular internet, only a lot smaller.
All right, we'll get to that. So what does it actually look like?
This is a question I get all the time. You know, I hear about this deep, dark, spooky, whoopy, underground internet. What does the thing actually look like? I've never been there. And
holograms and,
you know, 3D, virtual reality. Actually, nothing could be further from the truth.
Right.
An awful lot of the dark web is very much what you're accustomed to on the common internet, with the exception that it's like it looked in 1997. There's not a lot of investment in many places on the dark web in that slick, you know,
GUI interface,
Apple level of design kind of interface. The search engines, the user interfaces, the communications. I mean, on the screen you'll see here a relatively well-known, as these things go, dark web search engine. It's a text box with a button that says search.
Very sexy.
Very sophisticated. I2P has kind of a Windows 3.0 thing going on.
Yep.
And a lot of IRC basically looks like if your Yahoo Instant Messenger were carved on stone tablets.
It definitely looks like Mosaic or Netscape or one of these old ones.
It looks like what you're used to if you've been on the web for a while. Yeah.
All right, so let's go back into, you know, how big is this awesome, huge thing, right, that's all around us? It's underneath this, it's deep, it's dark, it must be very big, right?
Yes, according to what you would read in the newspapers, you think that it's this, and I've heard this phrase used a number of times, the vast underground internet. So we thought we would take that question head on. How big is the dark web?
It looks like a blank slide to me, Eric.
Well, it's not blank. If you look very carefully, this is not to scale. If we'd been honest about it, the font would be too small for the human eye to see.
Wow.
It's really not very big at all.
It's about this big.
It's about this big is what it says. So let's give it some scale, because that really doesn't help me too much, Eric. Okay. So one way to look at the size of a web, if you will, is to look at the number of sites in that environment or on that network. Okay. And so rather than just kind of put out some statistics, we actually maintain our own internal research on this. There are some academic papers and so forth. But if you know what you're doing, there are some ways to get very good estimates of the total number of websites on the dark web. To put that in context, we thought it would be fun. I worked this up with our marketing team. Here are some things that are bigger than the number of sites on the dark web.
Love it. Hit me. What we got?
First, the .su top-level domain. This is the number of registered websites for the .Soviet Union extension. Bear in mind, this is a country that hasn't existed for 25 years.
Right.
.su has more websites than the dark web.
All right. All right, let's try something else to give me some sort of scale.
All right, something more familiar to the average user.
Yep.
There are more tweets produced in 18 seconds than there are sites on the dark web.
That's seconds, like.
Yes, and
18.
this is not, being facetious or made up. We have done the arithmetic. That is about right on an average day.
All right. Why don't you give me some sort of physical representation so I can sort of visualize how it might look?
Yeah, here's a simple one. There are fewer sites on the dark web than there are seats in the Rose Bowl. Okay?
That's helpful.
If websites on the dark web were individuals, you couldn't fill a football stadium. That's how small the vast underground internet is.
But Eric, how small is it?
So, obviously we're having a little fun hammering home a point here, but the relative scale, I think, is actually the germane question.
Right.
So, how do you put that in the context of the surface web? Well, at the level of the number of sites on the dark web versus the surface web, again, we've actually done the arithmetic. If you chose height as your metaphor,
okay, let's do that.
If the dark web was a Lego brick, the surface web is the Empire State Building.
Right, so a Lego brick that might be on the sidewalk that you would walk past and not even notice. That's what we're saying the size comparison is here.
That's right. Compared to the Empire State Building, again, not being facetious, we've actually run the numbers, and this is a roughly accurate metaphor.
Wow. All right, so let's talk about weight.
Yep. If you prefer to look at the number of sites relative to the dark versus surface web in terms of mass rather than height, then literally, again, having done the arithmetic, it is the relative ratio of a bull elephant to a banana.
I love that you got the banana in there. All right, so one last giggle for us here, right? So you're going to give us another scale. We're talking about pages this time.
Yeah, and this is an important distinction. And the reason we're hammering this home is we will get into the business side and the intelligence literally in just a minute. But the reason we're hammering this home is to counteract the sort of nonsensical level of frenzy that has gone on around the dark web. For a sense of scale of the content, right? The number of sites is one way to look at the question. But much like ericsblog.com and Amazon are each one website with wildly different amounts of content on them.
Right.
Another way to look at this is estimates of the total number of actual pages, which is in some ways a much better metric for the amount of content that is being generated and viewed in each of these environments.
Okay.
Just the surface web, the part that's indexed by search engines, the part we can all reach easily and find without trouble, if we considered the approximate volume of known pages on the dark web versus the surface web, if we stacked up all the pages on the dark web and they were big enough to fill a shoebox, then the surface web would be the length of a highway that stretches from Baltimore to New York.
Wow. So if we put that shoebox on the road, right, a car is obviously longer than that, but that gives you some perspective on how small that actually is.
This is the proverbial first step in the 1,000-mile journey, right?
Wow.
This is how small, in a relative sense, it is. Now, again, as we'll discuss, there is valuable business intelligence and threat intelligence to be derived from this environment. But I'll close this portion of the webinar sort of hitting this over the head with a hammer, which is this vast and spooky environment is neither vast nor particularly spooky. To access, for example, the Tor network, it involves a highly complicated process of going to thetorproject.org and clicking download on a Tor browser. After that, it looks kind of like Firefox from 2006, and my mom could use it. So let's put to bed the in our opinion, somewhat nonsensical notions that at a very base level, this is either vast or truly mysterious.
Very good, Eric. Thank you. And again, I know we belabored that, but the key thing is we wanted to give you that context. So
Absolutely.
So let's talk about, and again, in preparation for this, we want to talk about why people use it, and not all the bad things. We're going to get into some of those, of course, as well, and understand what the risks are. But why do people gravitate towards this environment? And some of them that we've got listed here is, you can navigate without being tracked with cookies and things like that by marketers or social engines.
That's right. The Tor network, for example, was originally created explicitly to anonymize users so they could go places. For example, it was actually a project started by the United States government in part to allow dissidents to reach content that their own governments were trying to prevent them from seeing.
Right, and again, we've got that listed down here that because individuals want to interact anonymously, maybe whistleblowers is another area, that there's some sites dedicated to that type of activity.
That's exactly right. Again, political organizations, folks who are trying to reveal wrongdoing or corruption, these are common examples of why someone would use, for example, a dark web network, the Tor network or similar, to anonymize their online activity.
And there may be some paranoia from certain people that the government watches them all the time with their web traffic, and in fact these services can. So, there tends to be government surveillance or monitoring, so they try and go there to avoid some of that.
Absolutely, and in some cases and in some countries, it can be an effective tool in that regard, and in some cases and places, the paranoia may in fact be justified.
Got it. And then we're talking about marketplaces and anonymous purchases of items that you may not want people to know you're buying, right?
Yes, and while of course this can have a downside, again, depending on where you live and what those things are, the combination particularly of anonymizing networks and cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin can actually provide a useful outlet for perfectly legitimate reasons for those types of purchases.
Now we've got here, you can run markets for controversial sites or products, right? So you can launch some areas there, and you can also meet with communities of like-minded individuals to discuss things that may be considered to be controversial without being trolled or things like that on these sorts of environments as well.
That's right. And again, while there is certainly a downside we'll talk about in a moment, there are, again, entirely, if you will, white hat or good guy reasons to do this. And here again, if, for example, users live under a highly censorship-oriented or repressive regime and cannot speak openly online or in the public square, this gives those people a safe haven in which to collaborate.
Right. All right. So now we'll get back to some of the darker side of this environment.
Yes. And as I said, when we discussed the hype, there is a grain of truth in many of the sensational news stories. There is an awful lot of illegal and criminal activity going on the dark web. In particular, I've worked for about 10 years now as a volunteer on a committee at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and so I'm unfortunately rather versed in some of the statistics of that particular area. There is a University of Suffolk study, for example, that ran a whole range of research nodes on various dark networks and concluded that despite the hype to the contrary, only about 1 to 2%, I think it was, of all the content on the dark web is child exploitation related. However, it unfortunately receives more than half the traffic, which says as much about the people who use the dark web as the people who post on it. So, of course, the Silk Roads, the Alpha Bays, the dark marketplace where you can buy medical-grade cocaine and a 9mm and have them shipped to your door, there is truth in all of that. But it would be wrong to think that that is the dark web's only purpose.
Right.
And as we discussed, it was actually, in the case of Tor, for example, it was actually created by our government for entirely positive purposes.
Right. So before we transition, and this really is a pivot point into the business side of our discussion, Eric, just noteworthy, a lot of the articles here are of people being caught that have interacted in the dark deep web.
Yeah, a great point. We said that a couple of the myths we were going to dispel was that, A, there's only criminal activity there. Absolutely not true, as we've discussed. That they're down there because it's completely impregnable or opaque to law enforcement. Nothing could be further from the truth. As the founders of Ross, the founder of Silk Road, can tell you. If you so much as mess up one little step, it is possible to track down the users of even the largest and most successful criminal sites on the dark web. And to James's point here, whether it is the Tor network using Bitcoin for payments, et cetera, there is in fact a vast industry of providers, tools, technologies, and so forth that can do a very effective job of giving law enforcement, when appropriate, visibility into these networks, these actors, their activity, and their payments. Every one of these screenshots and many, many more like them show that this is neither nearly as impregnable or opaque as its users believe.
Well, and again, eventually, if it's a product, that has to be shipped, and that turns into a real world.
Where the cyber world meets the bricks and mortar of reality, there's still a crossover point, and that's often where people get themselves in trouble.
Very good. All right, so let's go back into why a business person would care about what's down there.
Yeah. So just to keep with our signposting, we've moved along fairly quickly here. We've talked about some of the myths and the realities of the dark web, its size, what it looks like, what's down there. Now, the heart of the matter to a business audience is, why do I care? What's down there? And we're now speaking to you presumably as representatives of primarily commercial enterprises. There are lots of other things I could talk about with my mom. As a business matter, let's talk about what's down there that says, why should I care? Why should I be concerned about gathering threat intelligence from the dark web?
Right.
Here are a few common examples of things we see every day, sometimes in staggering volumes. Financial records, whether extracted from a financial system inside the enterprise, tax returns, tax forms, W-2s, which there's been about a 2-year campaign scamming W-2s out of companies all across the United States. User credentials is another one. Many of the companies that tout intelligence from the dark web are primarily focused on the recovery of user credentials. To put some sense of scale to this for the folks listening, in an average week, LookingGlass will recover several hundred breach data packages through our automated collection systems and researchers. That will typically constitute millions of new, previously unseen credentials pairs, username and password, and our database comprises literally billions with a B of unique stolen credentials. This is so widespread that the ones you read about in the newspaper are merely a drop in the bucket compared to what's actually going on. You also have both real stolen and synthetic identities, up to and including documents, birth certificates, driver's licenses, and legitimate passports that will pass right through a computer check at a border. As a business person, the one that would keep me up at night most is not even the money, right? Money is, you put a reserve for fraud on your balance sheet and you move on with your day.
Right.
It's intellectual property. The fourth screenshot from left to right, the lower right there, this is an actual screenshot of a directory listing of a defense contractor's files where someone basically just pulled down a copy of an entire hard drive and uploaded the whole thing. And both because it's a cool visual and it's a story some may have heard about, this is not made up. That's a blueprint for a 5th generation fighter. And in the case of the F-35 stealth fighter, one of the subcontractors left an antiqued computer connected to the internet, and a portion of the blueprints for the stealth fighter went right out the door. So intellectual property is the crown jewels of most companies today, and that, to me, is the single biggest thing I would be worried about showing up online.
And that's the bought and sold. That's taken in by one of the hackers or one of these fraudsters down there, and they sell it to foreign nationals or individuals, things like that.
Absolutely. And, people say, how bad can this get? We've often told the story of Nortel. Canadian communications equipment maker. They were penetrated so badly for so long that it destroyed the company. And after the company went bankrupt, several of their IT people testified in various proceedings that they had known and told management that the foreign state hackers of a specific Asian country had been in their networks for 10 years, and they knew it. And the loss of that IP eventually allowed foreign competitors, to undermine everything they sold.
So you're going to drill down on one aspect of the dark web and one of the types of fraud that is committed or types of hacks.
Yeah, here's the other thing I'll mention to the business audience. For those who are not familiar with the term, dox or doxing is one of the most prevalent ways that hackers, particularly hacktivists, make very personal attacks on organizations that they are targeting. Docs or documents, it's essentially the practice of choosing a human individual, not a company, and building a personnel file or dossier on that individual. Now, as an exercise, I have both had this done on myself and done it on myself over the last few years in being in this business for nearly 20. Mm-hmm. And here are just a few examples of the ways that such a dossier gets built. In the United States, at least, all campaign contributions to national political campaigns are public. You are required to put your name, your address, the amount you gave, and your employer. That could easily lead to my LinkedIn profile, research papers that I've written, patents that I've co-authored. If you're a service member, there may be access or copies of your service records. Mm-hmm. The last one on the lower right there, my personal favorite, does not pertain to me as an individual. It pertains to the person who rammed into my car one time. In the state of Maryland, at least, just for illustration,
right,
all traffic violation records are public, including name, date of birth, height, weight, hair and eye color, and license plate of the person receiving the citation. All of this is more than enough for me to, for example, craft a spear phishing or social engineering message that is so personalized, tailored, and believable that I can get almost anyone to click on almost anything. And that method, malicious links, poisoned attachments, that spear phishing email remains, after many years, the single most effective way to penetrate an organization. This is not a hypothetical. We routinely find personnel dossiers on senior executives at major banks, government agencies, some of our enterprise clients.
So again, they can get in with this data and get even more data, or they can use it for a business email compromise scam or other things like that.
Absolutely, and these types of dossiers are posted and sold and traded, and if the motivation is ideological or political, given away for free on the dark web.
Very good. All right, so let's talk about some of the value. Now, we've talked about the business risk aspect of it. So let's get into the different things that you would want to monitor as a business on the dark web.
Yeah. So now, having put in its proper perspective that this is a small but potentially rich environment, there absolutely is a business justification, a value proposition for monitoring these dark environments. Here are just a few of the things that an organization can gain with a properly managed dark web monitoring program. Okay. First, awareness of threat actor plans, discussions, and activities, what the national security establishment refers to as chatter, for example, among terrorists. Well, hackers do it too. In fact, they blab all the time about what they're up to and who they're mad at and how they do stuff.
Propose targets. They also do some voting, things like that from time to time, right? Here's a list of candidates. Who do we hate most this week, right?
Click the survey monkey for who we should DDoS tomorrow. If you think we're making this up.
They talk about tools and what they should use against them, what the vulnerabilities are. Does anybody know anything about that company, right?
Absolutely. And that helps proactively identify threats to systems, a dossier or discussion of a key executive. Also, we should point out, it's not always the people at the top. The people with the keys to the kingdom. This can be executive assistants, general counsel, outside attorneys, system administrators. Contractors. So you can proactively see activity around some of these types of threats. You can also reduce the attack surface. So credentials, as I mentioned, is one of the big data hauls or types that vendors, including us, will often discover in our dark web monitoring.
What are the credentials, usernames, passwords?
Access credentials for systems.
Yep.
A very simple but powerful way to reduce your attack surface is as new credential pairs, username and password, are discovered for your organization, have them automatically fed into your identity and access management system, or at least to your IT personnel who can then manually go and force a reset on the compromised credentials. If those credentials were recovered, for example, from a malware drop site for a known piece of malware, it may help lead you to an unremediated infection. Because if you change the password and the malware steals the new one 5 seconds later, you haven't helped the problem.
Great.
You can also reduce your time to discovery. We've all read stories in the paper about companies that were penetrated for months or years before knowing it. If there is evidence of data that has left the building that shouldn't have, you can begin to trace that back and find the problem much sooner. Finally, for those in the physical goods business, there's a lot of both counterfeit but also a lot of stolen product being sold in these marketplaces. So you can help, in many cases, track that back, identify where stuff's leaking out the warehouse door, and reduce your fraud costs. If you have a talented group of or skilled group of researchers or technical specialists, you can also get ahead of the curve. You'll see new vulnerabilities being discussed or offered for sale. You'll see new pieces of malware that no endpoint security program yet detects. They can be taken apart, they can be studied, and you can harden your defenses before that new threat comes to your door.
Very good. So one of the things we wanted to talk about was in the hype section, we had a little bit of an asterisk there on one of the things in regards to if you didn't know what you were doing down there, you could get in some trouble. Yeah,
if the previous slide is all the reasons to monitor the dark web, the next slide or two is about why and how you need to do it properly.
Okay.
So one of the risks that this type of program or activity poses is if you sort of fire up your corporate laptop from your corporate network and you go stomping around on the dark web, it is peopled by technically savvy actors. And the result is that if you make missteps, and this was the one we said had the largest grain of truth to it, they actually may know who you are. Now, for those in the security space, you may know Brian Krebs, formerly of the Washington Post, who runs the Krebs on Security blog and is a very capable technical researcher. He penetrates criminal gangs. He writes about and studies botnets. He knows his way around. Even someone with his technical capabilities, he angered the wrong person and simultaneously had his website taken down by a DDoS, a denial of service attack, had his door kicked in by the SWAT team, and had himself put in handcuffs because someone had mailed him heroin, then called the police spoofing his phone number to say there was an intruder in his house, and then described him as the intruder.
Hence the swatting.
Hence the term swatting. It is, by the way, he is hardly the only person this has happened to. The point of this tale is, and he recently posted several years later that these
2003 versus 2007, so that's the gap of time.
That these folks were brought to justice. They were prosecuted. But the point is that even a technically savvy actor can face real-world identification and consequences if you go poking around in places without the appropriate stealth, non-attributable network presence, personas that are maintained, tradecraft, to use the intelligence.
So a lot of risk for a little environment.
Yeah. There's another risk we should just mention very quickly. As we discussed, one of the perceptions that has more than a grain of truth to it is that the dark web is full of both child pornography and malware. Those are both things you definitely don't want on your computer. And going back almost 10 years now, there are whole families of malware that hijack your computer in order to host child pornography, the simple possession of which is a felony. And so the my computer did it, it wasn't me defense, yes, it might work in court, but it's really not a place you want to end up to begin with. So in an environment full of illegal content, dangerous files, and technically savvy actors, if you're going to run a program like this, either engage with a vendor who knows what they're doing or ensure that your team does.
Excellent, Eric. Thank you. So, like, one of the things that I want to make sure that we talk about a little bit is this isn't just unique. These problems that we're talking about are not just unique to the dark deep web.
Yeah, and that's really a good kind of closing thought before we recap and take questions. It doesn't have to be dark to be bad, is the phrase that I often use. There are all of these types of risks and more present, yes, on the tiny but rich dark web or dark net. That is true. But just to give you a few ideas about other places these things are discovered daily by folks like LookingGlass. We currently track more than 6,000 web and blog and social media accounts linked to known actors. Many of them happily chest thump and post about all the nefarious things they're doing, done, or going to do.
Right.
My mom can reach every one of those pages. There's no dark web necessary.
Right.
There are more than 100 paste-bin and paste-like sites that we currently monitor for all kinds of data dumps, breach files, user credentials, and these are on public websites that anybody can visit. Of course, there are well-known and less well-known sites dedicated to leaking information. WikiLeaks, AnonLeaks, DocStock, Scrib, Siphon. There are hundreds of these sites. And one of the most interesting sources of inadvertent disclosures that we have seen lately, all on the surface web, all entirely unintentional, are code repositories like SourceForge and GitHub. Two developers collaborating on a project 1,200 miles apart. One says, oh, I built this test code. I upload it to the website. The other guy works on it. Well, it's test code. So, for example, we see all the time people doing things like hard-coding passwords or API keys into the code.
Wow.
And even if they go in and overwrite the file, GitHub, like most wiki sites, etc., all of the changes are logged. So all you have to do is go back in the history and click 2 versions back, and password or API key is still in there.
Amazing. All right, so we're winding down now. We've got a couple of little things, a recap and then some questions. But Eric, so let's boil this whole topic, this whole discussion today down into one slide. How can we do that?
Great. Let's hit on the takeaways.
Right.
Okay, tick them off on my fingers. If I had 6 fingers. The dark web is actually a range of both web and non-web environments. But as a group moniker, just understand it's a lot bigger than Tor.
Right.
Or I should say it's a lot more varied than Tor. Contrary to popular belief, it's not a big anything. It is, in fact, relative to the scale of the Internet we're all familiar with, search engines, social media, the public web, etc. It is microscopically small, although can be a good source of content. There absolutely is business value in monitoring those environments, and we talked about some of the specific business risks that can be identified through an effective intelligence monitoring program, open source or web monitoring program. But to do so effectively, there is a level of stealth, skill, and tradecraft that is required to do so without creating more risk than you are mitigating, because stomping around in big boots, leaving big footprints against technically savvy adversaries is a good way to make more trouble than you are solving.
Right.
And finally, again, put the dark web as a useful, interesting source of intelligence into its proper context. There are tens of thousands of places on the, quote, regular web that can be just as useful, just as important, and just as worthy of your threat intelligence gathering attention. So see this for what it is. It is a piece of a puzzle, but it is by no means the whole picture.
Right. So it's part of a mature program, but it is no way the dominant part of it.
Not at all.
Very good. Well, Eric, thank you very much for walking us through that. We now have a little bit of time for some Q&A. So again, there's a question section. You can submit some questions, and we can walk through those. So what do we have there?
First question, what can I find in the dark net that my other tools and services may not find? Thank you for the question. We touched on this a little bit, I think, after this question was posted, but to be very explicit, in kind, there is nothing specifically, I would say, that would only appear in the dark web that wouldn't potentially also appear on the surface web. However, certain types of things do appear more on the dark web than the surface. So for example, large scale, by which I mean millions of records, not thousands of records, large scale data breaches. LinkedIn, Adobe, Ebony, Ashley Madison, things that run 10, 30, 50, 100 million records.
Right.
Those will typically be more likely to appear on the dark web. Contrarily, by the way, if you're selling counterfeit goods of a mass market variety, hacked cable boxes, luxury stolen purses, that sort of thing, you're actually better off on Alibaba and Craigslist and Facebook marketplaces because
more people.
The average consumers who are interested in those things are mostly not technically savvy enough to exist, to habit the dark web, inhabit the dark web environments. So it depends on the type of risk you're trying to mitigate. But generally speaking, and this was the point of one of our very last slides there, surface versus dark is less the distinction than what risks do you care about or what specific business problem is in your portfolio to try and mitigate, which I think actually brings us to one of our other questions. The next question we got was, can you address brand and reputation management and how this may or may not relate? Absolutely. Again, James and I always start, and thank you for the question, James and I always start with definitions.
Right.
So the caveat here is this will depend a little bit on how broadly your organization defines protecting your brand or managing your brand and reputation. But here are all sorts of things that one could consider part of a brand or reputation management on the dark web. If there is compromising or embarrassing or unreleased information from the new drug we're about to launch has failed FDA tests or clinical trials or something like that, which the FDA and the public and the stockholders have not been told yet, that is a reputation issue. It was about to be a stock valuation issue, and that might, if breached or stolen or known or you have an insider threat, that might appear on the dark web before it appears on the surface web. So there's the question of, or an embarrassing fact about an executive or something like that.
We've seen some stock-related issues in regards to DDoSing of institutions. So again, that sort of chatter in regards to threats. Absolutely,
and we certainly have customers who say if a hacking group is planning to attack me or posting about it on the surface or dark web, that is absolutely part of our proactive reputation management or brand management. On the flip side, some of the more traditional online brand management problems are much more prevalent on the surface web than the dark web. Typo squatting domains, which used to be a trademark issue until they started getting used for spear phishing attacks, sending from lookalike domains, sending emails to executives and finance clerks and stuff like that. You also have, obviously, the traditional logo, trademark, content theft, those types of abuses of the brand that are embarrassment, ideological hacktivist groups. It's no fun posting stuff to embarrass your adversary if you post it in an environment where 1% of 1% of 1% of users know how to see what you've posted.
Right.
So I would say at a high level, the two questions are brand and reputation management. There are absolutely issues that would be of concern on the dark web, depending on how broadly you define brand and reputation, but that in many cases, the most prevalent problems, certainly by volume, if not by level of risk, are as likely to be on the surface web. In fact, I would say the garden variety but regular or frequent problems are more likely to be on the surface. The much more rare but potentially much bigger risks would be on the dark web.
And again, like you mentioned, doxing an executive there or one of the family members of the executive of the board, those are other reputation issues that the company has if that sort of information gets out. And they found something as a result of that might be controversial.
Absolutely, and the business press is littered with stories of companies whose stock price or market performance or sales were affected by shenanigans of one sort or another in the executive suite or among the staff. So I would say brand and reputation issues can appear on the surface, social, deep, or dark web. The critical question for effective build-out and management of a program is what specifically is the range of risks that your portfolio, yourself as an individual or the team or functional group that you lead, what is the scope of that set of risks? Because they may be primarily in one environment, the other, or both, depending on which risk it is your job to mitigate.
Very good. I think we have time for one more, Eric.
Okay. So how important is darknet coverage to an organization's security roadmap? This question, in some form, is one we get all the time. How important is this versus that? And the honest answer is, in some ways, a depressing one. Because in order to answer your question about how important the darknet coverage is to a security roadmap or plan, depends on where you are with everything else.
Right.
What we call a maturity spectrum. So, for example, and this is true of a depressing number of organizations, as a Fortune 50 CTO put it to me at a conference one time, he said, listen, half the companies we look at, in this case for acquisition or whatever, but he said half the companies we study cannot tell us what is on their network and what it's running. So what he means is, if you can't inventory your assets, identify what needs patching, like the basic block and tackle of securing your network, if you don't have robust perimeter defenses, if you don't have clear policies and a way to enforce them, then worrying about the sophisticated nation-state hackers on a deep, dark Tor website, you are so far from worrying about that problem.
Right.
If you haven't, for example, remediated the 7-year-old SQL injection vulnerability that actor is going to use to breach your organization.
Right.
So, long way of answering, but the question of how important is darknet coverage to a program, I would say the answer is it depends how buttoned up you are on all the other stuff. Do you have a threat intelligence management platform? Do you have good threat intelligence coming into your organization? Is that threat intelligence operationally turning into changes in posture in the network? Do you have good and documented policies, and are they enforced? Are you training your employees to avoid spear phishing and social engineering emails and phone calls? So depending on where you are on that spectrum, if the other 99% of things are buttoned up tight, then absolutely we certainly favor it and would be happy to perform for you a dark web monitoring program. But keep it in the context of the broader security posture discussion. If you literally don't yet know how secure your network is or whether your web servers have been patched since 2012, take care of that first.
Well, and I think, again, one of the points you made early on is it's a source.
One of many.
One of many sources that you have to put into your intelligence program.
Absolutely. For example, our Scout Prime threat intelligence platform aggregates nearly 100 feeds and sources, many of them, but not all of them, sourced from LookingGlass. There are dozens of others. This could be seen as one or a handful of those sources or additional feeds. But the dark web is just one of a wide range of intelligence sources, all of which can provide value. You need a mature and effective way to manage all of it.
Thank you very much, Eric, for your time today.
Thank you, James.
Very interesting, and again, one of these interesting ones. So again, I hope you've all got value from your time with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Certainly look forward to you joining us in one of our future webinars together. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Dina Evans. Thank you.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Eric. Very insightful stuff today on the dark web. We're very glad to have this presentation, and thank you to everyone that joined us. Please note that each of you will be sent a link to the recordings of this full presentation for today. So if you happen to join us late and you missed part of it, you'll have that, will be sent to you directly to your email. And feel free to share that with your colleagues if you think it would be of value to anyone else. And we also have a list, as James mentioned, of our other webcasts and other upcoming ones that can be found on our resources page, which is on our website, and that's at LookingGlassCyber.com. Again, that's LookingGlassCyber.com. If you have any other additional questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. You can reach us either through marketing@lookingglasscyber.com or through sales@lookingglasscyber.com. And we appreciate the questions that came in from everybody. But again, thank you for joining us, and we hope to have you with us again in the near future. Have a great day.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.